As many of you guys on this channel know, I'm a huge fan of creature feature or monster movies in general, regardless of if they're bad quality, necessarily, as some people might say, or if they're really good. Movies like The Thing tend to cross the divide and just become great movies in general, regardless of if you're a monster fan specifically or a B-movie fan. Then there are others which are much more in the B-movie camp. Stuff more like, say, The Blob, for instance, which general audiences might not love, but monster fans probably will. It doesn't necessarily have as much crossover as something like The Thing, but it's definitely great for the genre. Then you have others which are maybe just straight up bad, which still tend to have cult followings, stuff like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or something like that. But then you've got some which are in this little sweet spot, if you will. They're not bad, definitely not. Sometimes they're actually outstandingly good, but they're just not talked about. They're not appreciated, they're undervalued, and there are a number of reasons why that can happen. Sometimes they can be a victim of circumstance. Even The Thing itself was overshadowed by E.T. in 1982. Various other movies are overshadowed by others at the time. Maybe just the marketing budget wasn't big enough. I think movies like Splinter, for instance, which is a fantastic movie in this genre, one which I've extolled the virtues of plenty of times on this channel, I think kind of suffered from that issue. The budget was super low, there wasn't a huge amount of advertising for it, and it didn't do all that well at all in the box office. But in the creature feature or zombie flick genre, it's one of the absolute best. One of the few which I would say even comes close to The Thing. It's not as good, but it comes close. Now this movie I would put in that category as well, and this falls more under the category of movies which don't tend to do as well because they're not English. Now of course that sounds very bigoted, but I don't mean because they're not as good or because you shouldn't watch them because they're not in English, but because simply the nature of the language barrier created therein prevents a huge amount of people who are in the West, say English-speaking countries as a whole, to actually enjoy these films. Movies like Train to Busan or Prey, which is a French movie which I've also reviewed. These movies don't get the same amount of chatter. Now Train to Busan has had more because a lot of people in Western countries have talked about it more, and that's what I've tried to do a lot on this channel, to highlight these movies which do deserve to be checked out more, watched more, talked about more, and this is definitely one of those. This is a German movie called, in English at least, Blood Glacier. Now the movie has some definite similarities to The Thing in particular, and the plot of the movie, of course without spoiling anything specific, revolves around a small, very cold setting where you have a group of people doing various roles within an overarching field of research. Not necessarily the same research being done by everyone, but they're all researchers in effect of different types. The main character in the movie though is not a researcher, as far as I remember at least. He's more of a caretaker, one of the only people who stays at the site rather than coming in and leaving at different times as the other researchers do. He's there with his dog, and he kind of just makes sure that everything's running properly all the time. He is your MacReady, if you will, from The Thing in this setting. And in a similar way to MacReady, although he's not overshadowing the others in the film, just like Kurt Russell didn't in The Thing, he definitely represents that focus of the movie. It really does revolve more around him, naturally. He doesn't take the spotlight, it just naturally goes to him. Now as far as how the story unfolds, again without really going into it too much, as I said, it's very similar to The Thing. It's not exactly the same, and if you imagine, to give you an idea, imagine taking the concept of The Thing but applying it more so to the animals in the region rather than the humans. That's kind of the case here. Any more explanation than that is going to start spoiling stuff, but if you know about The Thing, you can probably get an idea for what I mean by that. Now, with that being said, one of the things that I like about this movie, in fact two things actually in general which I really liked, were number one, it's very well lit. A lot of horror movies are very dark, they take place at night time most of the time, for obvious reasons. It's naturally creepy, or so a lot of people would automatically think, and it also allows you to have bad CGI or bad effects and not really notice as much because you can't see what's going on the screen. With some movies that works well, something like Halloween or Alien. Others It really doesn't. It just masks a lack of quality. This movie doesn't do that. There are some scenes at night, but the vast majority of the movie takes place in broad daylight. There is a lot of white in the background from the ice and snow, which makes everything really, really bright, a lot more bright than it will usually be under the, say, daylight conditions. It's not overly sunny most of the time, but the refraction of light keeps it very well lit. That's a nice change to see. It's not a deal breaker if it was night or dark a lot more, but it's nice to see that. It makes a nice change. Now, the other thing, and this is a more interesting one I would say, is the escalation of the film. Now again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but over the course of the film, as far as characters go and actors, it builds a lot more than I was expecting to. Because at the start of the movie, you've only got about 4 people and a dog in play. But then over the course of the movie, more and more people get involved. And that doesn't happen that often in horror films. Generally, the group that you start the movie with tends to be the group that gets picked off gradually. It doesn't tend to increase. Usually movies tend to have a big group, or at least a group, and then the numbers gradually dwindle. With this movie, it funnily enough works kind of in the opposite way. You start off with about 4 people and a dog, and then you get more and more characters introduced who eventually meet up with each other under different circumstances. And although, of course, you still get the body count, which you'd expect, it's interesting to note that that is the exact opposite to the way it would usually work. And that was actually an interesting difference. Now, when you're watching the movie, you won't necessarily notice that difference in the moment. It was just something which I found to be refreshingly different. So overall, this is a movie which, as you can tell so far, did some very interesting things. It made some good choices. Now, of course, being a German film, it is subtitled, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, but it kind of goes without saying. Of course, it's a German film. So, in a similar way to Prey or Old Boy or a variety of other foreign films, if you will, or non-English movies, you of course need to use subtitles. So if you're the kind of person who's not into that, which some people aren't, then you might not enjoy the film as much. Personally, I don't really get that. I have no problem with subtitles. Even on English movies, I like to use subtitles because you just miss so much background conversation or little nuances in conversation that you just don't hear properly when people mumble. And of course, mumbling is very popular in movies these days. But going back to this movie, there are certain things which I think they did really nicely, really well, such as the 2 which I mentioned in particular, the lighting and the increasing of characters. But then on the other side of things, there were a couple of choices made in the film, or just overall packaging choices, let's say, of casting, for instance, or the look or the visuals, which weren't quite as good. I wouldn't go so far as to say they were bad, but they just weren't quite as good. Now, one of those things is the actors chosen. Now, I don't, if I remember correctly, recognise anyone in this movie from anything else I've seen. At least, not that I could remember. That's not really a problem. It's just that those actors who were chosen, especially the ones which come in later on, there is a particular group of people who get involved, and you'll know who I mean as soon as you watch the film, but those actors felt like they weren't necessarily in the same movie some of the time. They feel decidedly more detached and more eccentric and more camp than the rest of the movie. The movie is not a camp film. It very easily could be. It's definitely a B-movie in that way, but it's not a campy B-movie. It does take itself seriously enough, but not so serious that it's dumb. It's a fine line to walk, but I think they pulled that off pretty well. And the other thing is that the effects have some great points, but some which aren't as good. Now, the great points are the design of the creatures, because in a similar way to The Thing, the creature design does vary, which is awesome. I love it when movies do that, because you can get bored of a monster if it always looks the same, or at least I can. This movie doesn't fall into that trap. It has elements which are carried over from different creatures, but they do change. That's very cool to see. Again, very reminiscent of movies like Leviathan, Virus, The Thing, some of my other favourites. But at the same time, the design of the creatures is very good. There are even some very good practical effects and animatronics and puppetry, but the unfortunate thing is the way the creatures are shot. Because the first time in the movie that you really see one of the creatures is in a, funnily enough, quite dark scenario at night. but it's well lit enough to see the creature, and there's a particular scene where the creature moves toward a character. It's well lit enough, but in a bad way, and also it's shot in such a way that the movement of the creature looks very under par, very B-movie-esque. And that's unfortunate, because the creatures themselves, if they were shot just a little bit differently, could have looked fantastic. And you could have shot it in such a way that it belied the budget of the film, as far as special effects went. Unfortunately though, some of the movements are a little bit jinky. You can kind of see the, let's say, remote control car aspect of some of the monsters when they're moving towards people, and that was a shame. At the same time, it wasn't a deal breaker for me, certainly not. I do still enjoy the movie, but it was kind of unfortunate. It will give you a little bit of a smirk. It's a little bit of a chuckle-inducing moment, because it kind of reminds you, oh yeah, I'm watching a movie. It kind of takes you out of the moment a little bit, but at the same time, you could view that as cute if you want to. It kind of harkens back to the old Harryhausen days and those kind of B-movies, so whether or not you want to view that as a bad thing, well, of course that's down to you. Some people will hate on it for that. Personally, I think it's adorable in kind of a weird way. It would have been nice though if they shot the monsters in a slightly better way as far as lighting. Even just the angle of the camera would have made a big difference, and sometimes the creatures' movements would have been a less is more kind of scenario, where some of the creatures, especially the one that I mentioned, the creature moves too much, and it's when it moves that amount that you can see that it's unrealistic. If they'd have moved the creature a little bit less, then the movements would have been more believable, let's say. But with that all out of the way, what about the individual scores? Because with a movie like this, depending on the viewer, it could quite easily swing either way. I think that there are definitely some people like myself who would happily put this in their monster library, and for those of you guys who enjoy the movies that I review in that genre, I think you should definitely check this one out. You will appreciate it, because I know that you do, because you enjoy those reviews that I do. But for other people, especially people who are coming into this movie maybe not as genre fans as we are, you might not enjoy it as much if you're that kind of person. If you're just a passing fan who's not super into monster movies, you might pick up on some of the downsides and amplify them more than somebody who wants to like the movie, which is more so me. I'm more in that camp. I don't forgive it. As I said, there are downsides, but you can take them all with a pinch of salt because you want to enjoy the movie and see it for what it is and what it's trying to be. So with that all being said, what about the scores? How am I going to score this movie? Well, first of all then, we have, as always, the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Blood Glacier, I'm going to give it a 6, because I do definitely feel that it was above the par where it should be, or where it should start, at least, as a 5 out of 10. I do feel that it did some things really well. It was refreshing in a number of ways. It tried things a little bit differently to how it easily could have gone. A movie like this, which has so many similarities to iconic monster movies, could very easily fall into the tropes of just copying those movies. This does not do that. There are plenty of differences between this and even the nearest of its rivals. If you want to consider it as an alternative to The Thing, which you kind of can, even then, very few things, if you actually put them side by side, are similar, if you actually view it objectively rather than as an overall concept, and for that I have to applaud it. At the same time though, of course it wouldn't be fair to score it ridiculously high, because the story is what it is. As far as the characters go, the casting, the choices they make, well actually once again I'm going to give it another 6, because in a similar way to with the story, I do feel that it was above par. The main character in particular with his dog, and also the relationship with the dog, is very believable, and he's an easy character to follow. There are some moments where his motivations change a little bit based on other characters who are there or who are going to be there, but essentially he's a good anchor point really for the film. You kind of follow him, you naturally take his side most of the time, and I enjoyed the way it played out as far as the characters. There were some, as I said earlier, who feel like they might be in a different movie, maybe a TV movie compared to the other people, but it didn't destroy it by any means. It didn't even come close. As far as the visuals, special effects, of course, makeup, practical effects, which is always going to be very important in a movie like this, I'm going to give it another 6, because I want to score it higher, but I do feel that overall the movie feels just below what it should be for me to give it a great score, if that makes any sense. It feels a cut above a TV movie, but at the same time not necessarily good movie level. I guess that's kind of the definition of a B movie, to some degree. And this is very much so that then, I guess, a B movie. But I would say a pretty good B movie. So I'm going to give it a 6. One of the reasons why, primarily, is what I mentioned earlier. If the movement and the lighting and the way they shot the creatures was done a bit better, it could have easily been a 7, maybe even an 8. Because the designs and the concepts were cool. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, the music, sound effects, of course, well, again, I'm going to keep the streak alive with yet another 6, because once again, for the exact same reasons, I feel that it was definitely above what it could have been, and I would say above what it should have been, if you want to look at it that way. It should have been a 5 at least, and it was at least a 5, and it went slightly above that, I would say, so I'm going to give it a 6 again. And as far as that goes, it really is as simple as that. There's nothing really to write home about as far as the music, the soundtrack, that kind of thing. It's kind of a light ambient music which gives it a nice feel, but nothing overly remarkable or insanely memorable. And finally, of course, as far as the most subjective to me personally by definition, the rewatchability and the entertainment factor, both on your own, then of course with a group, and in both senses whether or not it's enjoyable to watch once or with rewatchability as the goal. So it's a very broad category, this final one, and for that I'm going to give it a 6 to cap it off. Overall, a 6 in every category, because once again it is a movie which I'm definitely glad that I checked out. I would definitely watch it again to show a fellow fan, such as doing this review to highlight the movie, so it definitely has that rewatchability to some degree, but for me personally it doesn't have anywhere near the rewatchability of, say, The Thing, Splinter, Leviathan, Virus. It's not that level, but it is, I would say, probably about the same as something like The Blob for me, which, that's not bad. That's not bad praise. I am a Blob fan, but that's the kind of level that I would give it. I don't know many people who watch The Blob all the time or have the same love for The Blob as many of these other monster movies, so that's what I mean by that kind of, for want of a better term, B level. I would say that The Thing, Splinter, Harbinger Down, Leviathan, Virus, within the genre, they are A-level movies. Then I would say that ones like The Blob and various others like that are B-level. They're not bad, they're just not my go-to. They're more like what I'd watch maybe every few months rather than every few weeks. And I would put this one more so in that category. And overall, of course, with 5 lots of 6, we are giving it an overall score of 3 out of 5, which doesn't necessarily sound that great, but that's definitely not a bad score. That's well above the baseline of 2.5, and it is certainly a movie that I would recommend. One of the reasons, to be honest, why I'm giving it a slightly lower overall score than some other horror movies and monster movies isn't just because of the quality specifically or the actors specifically. It's just that, for me at least, in every particular way, be it the visuals, the audio, the characters, not so much the story is actually refreshingly different, but in each of those major ways, basically, it feels like it was almost fantastic, but not quite each time. And other people probably won't feel that way. Some people may absolutely go out of their minds for this and love it and have it maybe as their top 5, but for me that isn't the case. I can understand why other people would really like it. I really like it, but I wouldn't call it one of my absolute favourites. And to put it into an overall scale, I would say that on the overarching list of these kind of movies, creature features, monster movies, alien movies within this kind of subgenre, I would put it probably in the top 15, maybe. And that's not bad. It would probably be in the lower end of that scale, but still, that's not bad. When you've got movies like The Blob, The Thing, Splinter, Leviathan, Harbinger Down, all of those, it's not bad to be in the top 15. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking it out. Just don't go in with expectations as high as some of the others which we've discussed. Overall then, that's it as far as this review goes, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.